I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, to all the fans around this virtual table. I would say also that in Institut Montaigne in Paris, we very much value our cooperation with the Austro-French Centre on Rapprochement in Europe. We value very much the expertise of our friends in Vienna. And also we think it's a very good opportunity to have this kind of exchanges, especially with officials of the two countries who are kind enough to mix with experts. And I take the opportunity to say hello and thank you to the two officials of our ministries. And now I hope you will enjoy the discussion.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Duclos. Let me also echo what you said on behalf of the Austro-French Centre for Rapprochement in Europe. It was actually an idea which was proposed by the Institut Montaigne to have this event today. And I think it inscribes itself very well into what we have been doing on the Eastern neighborhood and more specifically on the Eastern Partnership in recent years. But having this specific event on the Ukraine in the form of a French-Austrian dialogue is something I think which is very timely, very welcome. Even more so since we had the summit meeting between the European Union and Ukraine in Kiev earlier today. I'm sure that the representatives of the two ministries and the experts will come back on that in more detail. But quite apart from that, I think having this exchange not only strengthening the partnership we have with the Institut Montaigne, but also doing it in this specific format is something which I'm sure adds value, and I'm very much looking forward to a very fruitful and interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dietmar, and thank you, Michel, for this opening remarks. I am Magda Stumpfel. I am Research Fellow at the Austro-French Centre for Rapprochement Europe, and I'm very happy to moderate this conference this afternoon. The aim of this conference is to have an Austro-French dialogue, as already explained by my colleagues, on the EU-Ukraine relations, to look at the difference of the Austrian and the French bilateral relations, but to approach the topic also from a broader context in a later discussion, to look at the role of the OSCE, the Normandy 4 format, and other third actors on the ground. Without further ado, I will open up the floor for the first part of the event. Mr. Seiler, Deputy Director General for Political Affairs and Director of the Russian and Eastern Neighborhood Department at the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and Madame Dumoulin, Deputy Director for Russia and Eastern Europe at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, will tell us more about the bilateral relations between their respective countries and Ukraine. How did the relation develop? Where are we now? What is special about their respective relationship with Ukraine? So, Mr. Seiler, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you for the invitation to participate in this virtual discussion exchange, Monsieur Duclos, and of course I'm very happy to see Ambassador Schweißgut, Thomas Meyer-Harting, all really a challenge to speak in this environment. Maybe let's, before I will come to a few points and hopefully not being too long, let's start with that what Monsieur Duclos mentioned with the EU-Ukrainian summit, actually, that was taking place yesterday, today. If you read, I mean, of course, one of the parts of the summit declaration to which journalists will watch, what will it say in terms of rapprochement of Ukraine and the European Union? Will it go? How far will it go? I mean, the summit paper and also the statement afterwards is also important for us within the ministries, because frequently we take in them as a reference for our information package, for our, let's say, what we call speaking notes for the minister each time when he goes to speak about Ukraine. So the question, did it go very much beyond the document of last year's summit? As you know, the summit is taking place each year. In this one aspect is no, it stayed pretty much the same like last year, let's say, referring to the political association and economic integration of Ukraine with the European Union, but always in context on the basis of the association agreement and its deep and comprehensive free trade area. That's then, of course, sometimes we are then tempted, and you have to always to make speech drafts very short to maybe take only the first part, but the first part does not go with the second part. So that's for let's say the most recent development. As far as Austria is concerned, Ukraine, I don't need to outline that too much. Ukraine is an important partner for Austria, both in political terms, trade terms, cultural terms. There is this historical heritage, of course, with all our Habsburg nostalgia. We like to refer to now Lviv. Before we said Lvov, Lemberg, the biggest former biggest eastern city of the Habsburg Empire, and this is translated actually in the written program of the Austrian government. Where a few countries are mentioned, and Ukraine is mentioned as an important partner, and even going a little bit, I would say, beyond the summit declaration document, where it reads, Austria's aim is an economic and political approximation of Ukraine to Europe, let's say, without necessarily referring to the association agreement. Bilateral relations are very good with Ukraine. We had last year president's visit of Zelensky with all the usual meetings, business forum. Bilateral agenda is regularly worked through. As a trade partner, Ukraine is our, I think, third most partner if you take all the countries of the former Soviet Union, after Russia, but let's say formally also after Kazakhstan, whereas Kazakhstan, this is mainly due to a still large part of oil exports from Kazakhstan to Austria. We would say, of course, that concerning the relations to Ukraine, where Austria is participating, is also very much in many aspects determined through the association agreement, with including the deep and comprehensive free trading part, where this is already in force a couple of years. We think there is still a lot of potential. It's not fully explored in, let's say, both competition, technical barriers to trade, phytosanitary rules, customs. I'm sure my colleagues could elaborate on this a lot more. We continue to support the reform process with Ukraine. You have also to see, for example, that there is an annual reform conference on reform in Ukraine that was hosted by several countries. Next year it will be hosted not necessarily by European Union countries. Next year it will be hosted by Switzerland. We welcome the dynamic development of the relations. We support Ukraine in also aspects like engaging in the European Green Deal. There are a lot of economic projects going on, also including, for example, substitution of the gas flows with alternative substances. We have then the second thing I would like to mention, which is of course that both Austria and the EU share the commitment to the independence of Ukraine. There was the 30 years of Ukraine's independence. Then this includes, of course, the sovereignty, territorial integrity with all the aspects concerning the Crimea and the Donbass. We have the Eastern Partnership aspect. The Eastern Partnership, I think, is also a relevant, let's call it maybe for a moment, a relevant tool. As you maybe know, it's coming out from the 16 countries that participated in the European neighborhood policy. There is now 6 in the Eastern Partnership, or let's say in reality now 5, as Belarus suspended the membership for the time being. There is a good chance that the first physical summit will take place in December. The Eastern Partnership is for us important to promote, of course, economic relations, connectivity, but also rule of law, democracy, all kinds of reforms where we are still while we are still appreciating the Ukrainian efforts. We of course hope there will be more to come. And results, I mean concrete results for the people of Ukraine. You can see, for example, with the visa-free regime for Ukrainian citizens for the short-term stays. I still remember, let's go back maybe 12 years when I was preparing the Corepa 2 and the Foreign Affairs Council within the ministry at the time when Thomas Meyer-Harting was the political director of the ministry. We had, when, for example, the aspect of perspective for a visa-free regime, we added always as a long-term goal. So, and this was kind of one of our positions that we always put. We had a few things that we always try to put in any draft, like Nabucco had to be included and visa-free, yes, but as a long-term goal. But even, let's say, as a long-term goal, it can become reality. If I'm correct, this was becoming reality in 2017. So when I just wanted to mention that, because when we talk about Eastern Partnership, when we talk about the association agreement, and when you then talk with Ukrainians on that, it looks very much artificial, but it lays the basis also for concrete improvements on the ground. Whereas the ultimate question that you put in your outline on this meeting today concerning accession perspectives, that's of course a question that nobody would dare really to answer, but I'm hoping for input of the colleagues on that. Thank you very much for the time being.
Thank you, Mr. Seiler. Without any comments on this point, I would give over to Madame Dumoulin right away.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this very timely discussion. I'll try to be short, and I'll try not to be redundant with what just has been said. And it will be difficult because we obviously share a lot of
hopefully
with our Austrian colleagues. So just in a few words, I think everybody will agree that 2014 was the major turning point for Ukraine, or for post-Soviet Ukraine, but it was also the major turning point for the French-Ukrainian relationship. I think we can say that before 2014, Ukraine was just one of the post-Soviet countries among others, and there was no specific attention from Paris to this country. 2014 showed two things. It showed the deep aspiration for change of the Ukrainian people, and it showed the fragility of the security of the European continent, basically, which was affected by the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of Donbass. So this led France to engage with Ukraine in a more intensive way on two main tracks. The first one was the support for reforms across the spectrum of our policy tools, be it bilaterally, be it through the action of the G7. And I remind that the ambassadors of the G7 countries have a very specific role in monitoring the reforms in Ukraine since 2015. And of course, through EU cooperation and the Eastern Partnership. And here I won't say more because Mr. Zeiler already said things we basically share. The second track of our engagement, and probably the most visible, was our role in the Normandy format, which we actually initiated, hence the name of the format. And in the efforts to settle the conflict in Eastern Ukraine. And well, these efforts led to the summit in Paris, end of 2019, on which I can come back later if there is an interest to. And mentioning 2019, I think we can call it a second turning point in our relationship to Ukraine. Though the intensification of our bilateral relationship predated 2019, but 2019 really brought a more visible engagement of France with Ukraine. 2019 is the election of President Zelensky, and the first head of state he met, even before being elected, was actually President Macron, who received both candidates for the second round of the presidential election in April 2019. So he received President Zelensky even before he was elected. And as a sign of gratitude, probably, or at least because of the quality of the relationship established on this occasion, President Zelensky paid his first bilateral visit abroad in Paris in June 2019. This was also a sign of the increased bilateral cooperation in all areas, be it economy, culture, education. We have a very dynamic bilateral relation with Ukraine. Of course, COVID made things a bit more difficult last year, but still the relationship has developed very dynamically, including with regards to bilateral visits. And just to mention visits we had this year in both directions, we had President Zelensky, we had the foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba, in Paris in February, President Zelensky for a second bilateral visit to Paris in April, the deputy prime minister for Euro-Atlantic integration in July, and in the other direction, so from France to Ukraine, our Minister for Economy went to Kiev in May, and our Minister for Foreign Affairs went to Kiev end of August on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. And this was a way to reiterate our strong support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, which is, of course, still the main reason for our engagement with Ukraine. And well, we basically continue the track and our efforts for conflict settlement. You may have seen that there were talks yesterday between President Macron, the German Chancellor, and their Ukrainian and Russian counterparts. These were separate talks, but the goal is to try to convene at least a ministerial meeting in the weeks to come, and possibly a meeting at a higher level. If we manage to, which is of course quite of a challenge. Just to name the prospects for the next month. Of course, as has been mentioned by Mr. Zeiler, we are very happy with the outcomes of the EU-Ukraine summit that was held today. And we find that the final declaration is a good one, because it reminds the prospects for further rapprochement between Ukraine and the EU, but also it reminds the goal of reforms in Ukraine, which is still one of the issues we support most in our dialogue with Ukraine. And of course, we will keep our efforts to give substance to a very dynamic bilateral relation. I will stop there, but I'm of course available for questions if you have some.
Thank you very much. So as we could have seen, Austria and France have different, but at the same time as well, relations that have similar lines as well. They are both strong reform supporters. Mr. Zeiler mentioned as well, people-to-people contract. But Austria looks back at a very long history, as where Habsburg was mentioned, and Madame Dumoulin mentioned the year 2014 as the central year where the French and the Ukrainian relations came to another level. For sure, France plays a special role in the EU-Ukraine relations as the initiator of the Normandy format and as still a current mediator in the conflict in Eastern Europe. As well, what was not mentioned today, but I'll just drop it now as well, as we will talk about this later on. They have quite different positions as well regarding Nord Stream 2. Like France always had more or less its doubts about the project, if I'm rightly informed, whereas Austria and its partly state-owned petrochemical company OMV has different interests in the project. We just leave this here, and I'll open up the panel to just looking at the broader EU-Ukraine relations. And with this, I'm happy to introduce our distinguished panelists. First of all, Madame Goujon. She has been working on Ukraine for over 20 years and is regularly visiting the country. She's a professor at the University of Bourgogne and lecturer at Sciences Po Dijon. Mr. Meyer-Harting has been UN and EU ambassador at the United Nations in New York. And what is very interesting for us in this debate today, he was managing director at the European External Action Service from 2014 to 2019, where he followed the EU-Ukraine relations from a European perspective. In Mr. Duclos, he was ambassador in Switzerland and Syria, but which is more interesting for our discussion today, he was as well ambassador at the Political and Security Committee for the French Foreign Minister in Brussels, and is now advisor at the Institut Montaigne. Welcome. Madame Goujon, I would like to start with you first. We have now heard about the Austrian and the French approach to EU-Ukraine relations. Could you, as an academic, give us some insights in how Ukraine perceives the relations with the EU? And what changed since Zelensky, as Madame Dumoulin mentioned him as well?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. I will first focus on the Ukrainian policy towards the EU, and second about I would say the Ukrainian political opinion on the EU. So the Ukrainian policy towards the EU has not fundamentally changed since Zelensky came to power. From the start of his presidency, Zelensky has emphasized the prospect of EU integration for his country. The term of integration can be analyzed differently, membership or rapprochement. The setbacks in his dialogue with Russia, relaunched in 2019, about the war in Donbass, has convinced him of the importance of the EU-Ukrainian relationship, and more generally of the support of Ukraine's allied countries, especially with the maintenance of sanctions towards Russia. Ukrainian leaders fear the easing of the EU foreign policy towards Russia if the EU adopts a more pragmatic approach rather than one based on legal issues or on principles, since the situation in the Donbass might last longer, not mentioning Crimea. From the point of view of internal reforms that were mentioned previously, pushed by the EU leaders in each of their meetings with their Ukrainian counterparts, there is a recent accentuation of the policy called disoligarchization, with a law on oligarchs adopted late September on first reading. Experts have difficulties to assess this law and all the policy, even though the global trend is well appreciated. Is this policy aims to promote a certain reorganization of oligarchic groups, as suggested by previous presidencies? Is this policy favor a certain political control over the process, targeting specific individuals, since the National Security and Defense Council, headed by the president, will be in charge of the list of people, such as the pro-Russian MP, Viktor Medvedchuk, recently. A selective approach and non-systemic approach towards the fight against corruption has raised some concerns in the country. The president's conflict with the Constitutional Court in October, since I would say October 2020, testifies to the strong influence of leading networks prior to the Zelensky presidency, as well as the assassination attempt to the top advisor of the president several hours after the law on oligarchs was adopted. Civil society organizations in Ukraine see the EU pressure on Ukraine in the sphere of the fight against corruption, on reforms, as a key leverage for moving the agenda forward. Regarding the society, the percentage of the population in favor of Ukraine's accession to the EU has stabilized around 60% since 2014. In a poll conducted by the Ukrainian Center Razumkov in March 2021, 59% of people support this perspective, even if there exists regional and generational disparities. In the west and the center of the country, this share is around 83% and 63% respectively, while in the south and east is it around 41 and 38%. These disparities are explained by different experiences from an historical point of view that were also mentioned previously, and also politically. Young people who did not live during the Soviet period consider in a large majority that Ukraine should join the EU, 76% of them, from 18 to 29 years old, while those aged 60 and over are more reserved. If we look at the same poll, Ukrainians consider corruption and the low level of economic development to be the two major factors that undermine relations with the EU. As for what motivates the Union in its relations with Ukraine, they indicate in first position the use of intellectual and scientific potential of the workforce, and in second, the exploitation of natural resources of Ukraine. Most of those interviewed believe that Ukraine is geographically and historically European, but not politically, economically, and socially. The reasons for this opinion lie in the appreciation of the country's significant socioeconomic backwardness compared to the EU, and also its too slow approach to European standards. We should mention that Ukraine is one of the poorest countries in Europe with a GDP per capita, which in 2020 was equivalent to 20% of the EU average, while the country has significant economic resources. So I will probably stop here, and I am ready to answer some questions if necessary.
Thank you very much, Madame Bujon. So Ukraine as a very pro-European country, especially for the young generation, that repeatedly underlines its European choice, but probably feels to be capped in the waiting room of the European Union for already too long. Thank you very much, therefore. I would now like to hand over to Mr. Meyer-Harting. EU foreign policy is often described as a policy that has to take into account 27 national or internal policies, which already seems like a very difficult task. Under these circumstances, as someone who has followed the relations very closely, what would you say is the influence of the EU and the Ukraine? How did the EU-Ukraine relation evolve, and how would you assess the relations between the EU and Ukraine today?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak here today. I have to say, I was so deeply involved in my time in Brussels in the negotiation of statements of EU-Ukraine summit that it's quite a relief to be able to watch this from afar today. But I also have to say that when I read the text, I recognize quite a lot of the language, and I recognize in particular the passages which refer to Europe, to our sort of acknowledgement of Ukraine's European aspirations and welcoming its choices, which is something where every comma was negotiated over the years. And you will also notice, by the way, that this passage contains a reference to what the heads of state and government decided on this subject before the the Netherlands at the time were able to ratify the association agreement at the European Council of December 2016, where they in fact confirmed in a certain sense what the association agreement is about and what it is not about. But let me first of all say that obviously, Ukraine for the European Union is a very special partner. I would even say a strategic partner within its eastern neighborhood, not least because of the history of this relationship. Because what basically happened, has happened since 2014, has happened because Ukraine opted to make a choice, at least in favor of this association agreement with the European Union. And it's, although I mean, it's a point that has been made often in the past. This was a situation where people died on the streets of Kiev because of their commitment to Europe and Ukraine's European future. And I think one should also make the point that the very flagrant violation of the peace order, the European peace order that happened since 2014 is also, in a certain sense, the consequence of what happened in 2014. And therefore, the European Union can obviously never be blasé or disinterested about what is going on in the Ukrainian context and in its relations with Ukraine. It is also important to say, because there has been some misunderstanding at the time and in the past and the way this has been presented, that what the European Union offered to Ukraine in 2014 was not what you would call a binary choice. The European Union did not say to Ukraine at the time, you have to choose between us and the Russian Federation, although some of the signals that came out of Brussels at the time may have been misunderstood in this direction or were misunderstood on purpose in this direction. But what was clear was that the offer that the European Union made at the time to Ukraine was basically compatible with Ukraine also having reasonably good relations with its eastern neighbor. And the fact that this didn't work out that way, on the one hand, an association agreement and a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, and on the other hand, free trade relations with Russia, say, for instance, in the framework of the Commonwealth of Independent States, a combination that would have been perfectly possible from a legal point of view. The fact that this didn't work out, I think one has to say realistically, was also because the third partner in this operation, in these negotiations, didn't want it to happen that way. And it also has to be said that the fact that Ukraine is ever more insistent about wishing to make a binary choice, this is the result, of course, of what Ukraine has experienced since 2014 in Crimea, and with the illegal annexation of Crimea, and of course with the constant destabilization by Russia with the strong involvement of Russia in eastern Ukraine. So obviously, and I think one of the things that always fascinated me this is a sort of side remark, in the Russian-Ukrainian relationship is that you witness a lack of willingness from the Russian side to even recognize the national identity of Ukraine as a country. And I think that is certainly increasingly also pushing Ukraine in the direction that it wishes to take. But as I just referred to the statement that was made today, once again, we welcome Ukraine's European aspirations, or we acknowledge the European aspirations of Ukraine and welcome its European choice. But beyond that, more at the moment is not on offer. And I mean, in a situation where we even find it difficult to reiterate the promise that was made to the countries of the Western Balkans with regard to membership in the European Union. In fact, the only group of countries to which the European Union has ever offered this perspective, I mean, beyond, of course, 2004 in Thessaloniki. The fact that we find it difficult to reiterate this promise, I mean, will make it understandable why it is even more difficult to say anything very clearly or more beyond what we've said in this right now in a manner that would be agreeable to all 27 member states of the European Union. And while I think this is more for the Austrian-French Centre to discuss, there may be a very quite notable emphasis, a difference of emphasis between Austria and France when it comes to the Western Balkans. I'm not convinced that there's a particularly big difference in emphasis when it comes to discussing this perspective with regard to the Eastern partners, the associated partners of the European Union. But while a membership perspective is not on offer, at least not consensually on offer right now within the European Union, I still think that quite a lot is on offer. And what the representatives of the European Union constantly say is that the potential of the association agreement and the deep and comprehensive free trade area has not yet been fully used. And there's a lot there that can still be done, and a lot that needs to be done also from the Ukrainian point of view. This is in fact the closest and most structured relationship that the European Union has ever offered to any partner outside of its immediate membership. And you could probably argue that in some instances it even goes as far or potentially even further than what is on offer with the European Economic Area. And it certainly goes much further than anything the United Kingdom would ever be willing, interested in, or wishing to accept when it comes to its relationship, when it comes to the internal market with regard to the European Union. What can the European Union do in this situation? Obviously, it is not a direct partner in the Normandy talks and in the efforts of conflict management, but I do think it plays a key role in strengthening the resilience of Ukraine as a country. And I think nobody has collectively made a stronger contribution to the resilience of Ukraine than the European Union, with the many billions that are available for the country. But making the country resilient also requires a counter effort from Ukraine on the other side. And Mrs. Goujon referred to this. I mean, this is basically about handling the rule of law, good governance, and fighting corruption. And there, I mean, this is a subject that undoubtedly was discussed in some depth today in the summit meeting between the European Union and Ukraine. There is a lot of homework that Ukraine still needs to do, in particular, just to single out one element when it comes to reforming the judiciary, which is key, I mean, for the stability of reforms in the country. I think that something that will certainly have been mentioned today is the need to reform and complete the reform of the High Council of Justice, something that Ukraine has been working on for a long time. There have been some small steps, positive steps, I should say, in the meeting today. The aviation agreement, I understand, has come to a conclusion. This is something that I worked on for a number of years, and people worked on at the time. As those who followed the discussions may remember, it was primarily held up by a disagreement between Spain and the United Kingdom linked to how to handle Gibraltar in the framework of this agreement. So the fact that one has moved forward on this file is in a certain sense a rare positive side effect, if I may call it this, of Brexit. On the other hand, it is also clear, and I think it's worthwhile looking at the language there as well, that Ukraine expects and hopes for support of the European Union when it comes to energy security. And I think the language in this area is relatively strong. And it also, I mean, Ukraine was clearly quite distraught by the agreement between Germany and the United States regarding Nord Stream 2. And obviously, the European institutions were never as enthusiastic about Nord Stream 2 as Germany or Austria or some others were. So I mean, clearly it was easier for the European institutions to make the kind of commitments they have made on this subject today. And I think another subject where the European Union needs to obviously continue to provide support is simply supporting Ukraine's international stance when it comes, on the one hand, to the situation in eastern Ukraine. And there, obviously, the European Union supports the efforts of the Normandy the Normandy process very actively, and secondly, a continued commitment to uphold the non-recognition policy with regard to the illegal annexation of Crimea. And there, I think the strong presence of representatives of the European Union and European Union member states at the recent Crimea platform was quite indicative. There are also other areas where the European Union can help in this context. I myself, this was one of the last things that I did when I worked in Brussels, was involved in efforts of the European Union to strengthen the southeast of Ukraine, in particular the Azov Sea, following, I mean, the destabilization effects that one had witnessed there and the events surrounding the Kerch Strait. And it is good that the summit also seems to have provided some progress in this field. This is what I can say as an observer now on the outside. Obviously, the possibilities of the European Union are limited in some areas, but I still think that the European Union is the potentially strongest partner Ukraine can have when it comes to making the country resilient and keeping it on the path of reforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer-Harting, for this nuanced picture and for underlining as well the scope of the association agreement, where many policies, as you said, were still not exploited. And thank you as well for bringing in already the third important actor, Russia, and referring that there was never a binary choice to be either with Russia or with EU, that this choice has never been set to Ukraine from the European side, and to underline as well the strong support of the European Union on Ukraine's international stance. I would like to continue with the Normandy format again, which is like as Madame Dumoulin has already mentioned, Germany and France play a special role in the EU relations with Ukraine. Maybe Mr. Duclos, could you explain a bit more if this relation of Germany and Austria in the Normandy format affects as well the EU approach in general? Do they have more influence in other countries?
Let me say that first, the birth of the Normandy format was a bit circumstantial. That is to say, it was in the framework of the anniversary of the D-Day in Ouistreham, at a moment of great tension between Ukraine and Russia, a moment of fighting, so actually of conflict. And both the Ukrainian president and Ukrainian president and the Russian president were there, and other leaders, and Hollande and Merkel thought that there could be an opportunity to do something. What's important in this format is that the US made a deliberate choice not to join the meeting. That's to say, at this very moment, Obama was not in the room, but in the castle of Bérouville, and he was obviously consulted, and he was not interested in taking part in the meeting. As Marie Dumoulin said, the second birth of the format was in the Élysée Palace in December 2019, after Macron made a spectacular effort to relaunch, to reset the Franco-Russia dialogue in Brégançon in August. And at that time, it was very clear in Macron's statements that in order to pursue this dialogue, this initiative, it was very much needed to have headways in the Normandy format, that is to say, in the implementation of the Kiev agreement. Now, as you may imagine, this kind of small format is not very popular, is never popular by those who are not part of it, those who are excluded. For instance, the British in the domestic politics in Britain, it is often perceived as a missed opportunity, and sometimes more than that. And there has been criticism to the government in that respect. So there has been from time to time, in regular circumstances, the idea that either the UK or the US, or more often, both of them should join the format. This is an idea the Ukrainians themselves played with a number of times. Would it have been a good thing or not? I won't pronounce myself, because clearly, in fact, once again, the US were not interested. And I think that the last visit made by President Zelensky in Washington gave to the US president the opportunity to repeat that he is backing basically the European allies or partners on this issue, which is a polite way that they are not interested in joining the exercise. I would say that from the EU point of view, there are other examples of small formats. The most famous of them being the format to negotiate the JCPOA, with this time France, Germany, and UK. And the question arises: what are the criteria which would make that such kind of formats are acceptable, or even more than acceptable, are appreciated by other partners? If you take the example of JCPOA, I would say first, some kind of success, or at least some kind of contribution to the to moving forward a solution, and secondly, a good articulation that is not only transparency, but the possibility for other partners to play a part. And in the case of the negotiations with Iran, it's materialized by the simple fact that the EEAS is in itself an important player in the JCPOA process. It's not the case in the Normandy format. One cannot pretend that it's a very successful process, and the articulation with the EU is probably lighter. But in the same time, I think it seems to me, and speaking under the control of the officials, of course, that European partners understand that it would be much more difficult to do better, that basically the job of the Normandy format is to deal with high-level meetings and political issues, and for the time being, it's playing a useful role as a damage limitation process, but the bulk of the EU relations or European relations with Ukraine is clearly in the framework of the EU-Ukraine relations. So it seems to me that for the time being, it's an arrangement which is satisfactory for everybody.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duclos, for the explanation and as well to referring to other country formats. But to stay in Eastern Ukraine, I would like to mention as well another important actor in the region, the OSCE. And I read a rather provocative statement which said that EU diplomacy in Eastern Ukraine is a silent diplomacy, as it mainly supports the work that the OSCE is doing. Mr. Meyer-Harting, what would you react to the statement, and can you elaborate the work of the OSCE in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Ukraine, sorry?
I mean, obviously, the OSCE has two important roles there. On the one hand, through its lead role, if you want to call it that, in the trilateral contact group, with all the limitations and challenges that this group is facing right now. And I mean, the interconnection between these activities and what the Normandy format is doing on the one hand. And the other hand, of course, again, with all the limitations of the situation on the ground, the special monitoring mission is the only international presence that exists there in that part of the region. I mean, normally when to put it a little more bluntly, when the special monitoring mission gets a little too close to observing things with its drones, which are, by the way, financed by the European Union to a considerable extent, these drones seem to get shot down at an enormous cost for the operation involved. But I mean, that is basically the setup that was possible there. I mean, frankly, to sort of go back to the discussion, should the European Union be part of the Normandy format, I don't think it makes an enormous amount of sense right now. There were, as you know, phases in the early discussions on the conflict in Geneva, etc., when the European Union was involved. But I think the simple answer is that the Russian side simply considered the European Union as a party to the conflict because of the history of 2014 and because of the history of the association agreement. And therefore, I mean, obviously, if you want to change the format, everybody would have to agree to it. And I think it's relatively obvious that there would not be agreement on including the European Union in this format. On the other hand, of course, there is a clear link between the activities of the format on the one hand and EU policies with regard to Russia, because, as you know, that these famous guiding principles that we have on our relationship with Russia also are set up where I, at the time, helped to, get this off the ground. One of the guiding principles says that there can be no substantial change in our relationship there can be no substantial change in our relationship as long as the Minsk agreements are not fully implemented. And this has remained part of the creed of the European Union when it comes to relations with Russia, which has as a consequence that whenever a European Union body discusses relations with Ukraine or relations with Russia, you will normally find a situation where France and Germany report whether, in their opinion, there has been progress on the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And as the answer is the way you can expect it and has been the way you can expect it over past years, this has then sort of reflected in the overall discussions on relations with Russia. So there is an interlinkage between the two. I do think that the contribution the European Union, to come back to your initial question, the European Union can make to supporting the OSCE is very important. I think that there is no alternative for using the formats we have. And to be honest, for the moment, I think working for the OSCE in the Ukrainian context and the context of the trilateral contact group is, I mean, I would say a particularly challenging activity, to put it as mildly as possible.
Thank you very much as well to underline the interlinkage between EU OSCE normative format again. To leave Eastern Ukraine behind and to touch upon something that has been mentioned quite some times already today, the gas question and Nord Stream 2. Mr. Meyer-Harting already underlined that EU institutions were never that excited about Nord Stream 2 than Germany or Austria was. In this context, I wanted to ask you, Madame Goujon, if you can elaborate a bit how the gas question or the gas transit question has affected the relationship between the EU and the Ukraine. What were the main frictional points among the partners, and what were the alarming facts, if you can say so, for Ukraine?
The gas issue and probably the end of the US sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 project have been perceived as a bad signal by Ukrainian political elites who fear an easing of European and more generally Western policy towards Russia. In this regard, European leaders have constantly emphasized not just the economic nature of Nord Stream 2, but also its geopolitical aspect, stressing that Nord Stream 2 makes Ukraine more vulnerable to further potential Russian threat. And this argument may appear contradictory to the fact that Ukraine is no longer supplied by Russia, but the transit of gas, apart from the financial resources it represents for the country, makes Ukraine a country Russia had to deal with for transit its gas to Europe, and might paradoxically, in a certain way, give some leverage for Ukraine in its relationship with Russia. I think that the post-2014 context is also to be taken into account. The annexations of Crimea, as well as the conflict in Donbass, are in a way traumatic events for the Ukrainian elites, including some who were not specifically suspicious of Russia before 2014. And this trauma and the regular Putin speeches on the non-existence of Ukraine as a state, I'm referring to the essay Putin wrote on the historically integration of Ukrainian and Russian people in the Kremlin's website in July 2021. Make Ukrainian leaders all the more vigilant in the face of the country's real vulnerability, and which the Nord Stream 2 project tends to stress again. In this respect, Ukraine therefore relies on the most understanding partners to defend its cause, such as Poland and the Baltic states. On the European side, the Nord Stream 2 project is not a comfortable one, as I think it was already mentioned by Mr. Meyer-Hartning. And probably we can notice it through the declarative guarantees provided to Ukraine by the German Chancellor, which seems to me not comfortable one too. The issue of European gas dependency on Russia is also a major issue for the EU. And on the Ukrainian side, the Nord Stream 2 project has not called into question the policy of European integration. Ukraine needs the support of the EU, of course, but its leaders want constantly to alert Europeans to the threat that Russia represents in the EU neighborhood. The Nord Stream 2 project testifies to the necessary progress of the EU in its geopolitical approach. Partly against its will, when the Russian leaders want to show EU flaws on this aspect. The time of the great European family advocated by Russia in the mid-90s seems to be far away now. And Russia sees itself as a competing power of the EU in Europe, and continues to show its strength while testing the power of the EU in different spheres, such as economic, information, and security ones. I stop here.
Thank you very much. So the Ukrainian fear that that Nord Stream 2 could be used as a geopolitical weapon still exists, even if Germany and the US, so the main partners in this project, tried to exclude it in the joint statement in the summit in July. To take another step backwards and look at Ukraine, we've already spoken about many actors involved, but there are even, with Monsieur Duclos, I wanted to even touch on additional third actor in the region. Can you tell us more about the United States, China, or Turkey? What are their relations with Ukraine and what is their interest in the region?
I would say that there are two classic external actors, which are Russia, of course, and the US. Maybe a word about Russia. I totally subscribe to what Alexandra Goujon said. That is to say, we are maybe in a different phase now, in which the Russians are on the offensive and believing that they have an opportunity to destabilize the European institutions and democracy in Europe. In such a case, they could perceive, it's an hypothesis, of course, Ukraine as a leverage in that design. Maybe we talked a lot about the EU and so EU members. Maybe we should mention specifically Poland, because in the case of the agreement on Nord Stream 2, I think the Poles are also very much upset by the compromise between the US and Germany. Now, if we shift to the US, the strange thing is that the US seemed to hesitate or to oscillate between two options. A maximalist option, which would have been the Brzezinski scheme of Ukraine as being the center of the new great game in the East-West relations. The least we can say that we are very far from that now, and we are in a completely different state of mind, which is, let's say, the minimalist option, in which Ukraine is part of a general trend of relative disengagement, or at least maximum attempt not to take risk when it's not useful. And that is linked also to more domestic developments in the US. We should not forget, of course, that the starting point of the how do you say that? I don't remember the word. The process against la destitution against Trump in the Congress was the Ukrainian business. And for Biden himself, the stories about his son, all that is mixed with a lot of domestic sensitivities in the US. But for me, the basic point is that for the time being, you cannot imagine the US being strongly committed in the situation, let's say, around and in Ukraine for the time being. So that opens some ground for newcomers, specifically China and Turkey, for instance. China, for the time being, it's in terms of economic investments, with, I must say, some resistance on the part of the US. This is one thing on which they could still be committed, because they have an interest to avoid the transfer of major infrastructure in Ukraine under the control of Chinese capital. Turkey is a very interesting and special case, because they have with Russia relations of being at the same time friends and enemies. Sometimes they are in a position to strike deals, such as in Syria. In other situations, it's more confrontational, such as in Libya. And usually they go from confrontation to compromise. In the case of Ukraine, the Turks, in the context of the post-conflict in Karabakh, they went on the offensive in Ukraine, proposing highly modern military equipment, and probably it was perceived in Moscow as a blow. In the first instance, unexpected blow. To which extent it could continue like that? My sense is that it's part of a bargain, general relation of bargaining between Moscow and Ankara. But in the same time, with the current Turkish leadership, you never know. and it's certainly a parameter which is important to follow in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much for this geopolitical picture on Ukraine. To conclude this discussion, as mentioned several times today, the EU-Ukraine summit took place today. Expectations in the beginning were relatively low, but we heard a cautiously positive echo already on this panel. The partners reaffirmed the commitment to strengthening policies and economic integration. They acknowledged the European aspirations of Ukraine, and the EU promised to strengthen energy security in Ukraine. Mr. Meyer-Harting, if I may, as you who has expertise in EU-Ukraine summits, if I can say so, could you just tell us in one or two sentences, final sentences of this discussion, with what expectations for future collaboration, for future exchange, do you think that the summit partners left the summit today?
I mean, I think that in reality, from a Ukrainian point of view, it can never be enough, to be quite frank. And obviously, they have a tendency to look at the glass, and it's difficult to convince them that what they're getting is half full. But I do think, and I mean, I've not been now, as you know, in Brussels for some time, and I would not wish to present myself as an authority right now on what the thinking there is. But I do see a very strong commitment, both by President Charles Michel and by President von der Leyen with regard to engagement with Eastern partners. It is clear that, I mean, everybody expected President Tusk to have the strong interest that he had in the region. It was, in my opinion, not so obvious that Charles Michel would show a similarly strong interest, and it is very clear that the European Union is strongly committed. I mean, I think that one has to be realistic with what can be done in the years to come, in view also of the overall circumstances, and there is a lot of homework that needs to be done by Ukraine. But I think that the European Union certainly will stay engaged. And I think it's important that member states support the European Union in this effort. And I think that France and Austria, although they come from partly different angles in the discussion, can play a very important role in this. Well, obviously, I mean, each within its possibilities and responsibilities, but it's true that both can play an important role in helping to move this policy forward, in particular because they're not sort of amongst the usual suspects, if you may call it that, who are automatically fully engaged in these issues, but I think that they can play an important role in building consensus within the European Union.
Thank you very much for these good closing remarks. And I
wasn't planning to do a closing remark.
And with this, I will thank all of the panelists of today's meeting for their valuable contributions. And I'm looking for further exchange in any time with you. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Goodbye.